Good day. Today is Sunday, 23rd February 2025, and reading the media here in London today, and indeed checking out media in other parts of Europe, the degree of anger, rage, hysteria, panic about the fact that the Americans and the Russians are talking to each other is completely off the scale. I'm not going to single out or quote any particular article. You can find any number of them. It's not difficult. Just go to any British newspaper this morning, if English is your first language, and you'll find articles there that are really just quite remarkable in their emotional and a furious quality. If I had to single out a single one, which would be difficult, well, my old friend Simon Tisdall has written a particularly bizarre article. Well, I say bizarre, maybe that's not the right word. Expected article, which takes things even further than some of the others do, but which ultimately is not that different in its substance from any of the others. Now, just to make a few points here, and I've already made them, but perhaps it bears repeating. The Americans are not negotiating with the Russians the deal of a settlement over the conflict in Ukraine. The Americans have made it very clear that that is not what they are about. In fact, and just to say, on the Duran, we repeatedly said that it would be a great mistake for the United States to get bogged down in trying to negotiate directly with the Russians some sort of a deal over the conflict in Ukraine. The American purpose should be to tell the Ukrainians and the Russians to get on and to negotiate with each other. And if the Ukrainians were not prepared to do that, we suggested on the Duran that the United States could then say, well, it's done what it can. It's given Ukraine all the weapons and economic and financial and military support that it can, and that the point has now been reached where the United States can do no more. And if Ukraine won't negotiate and won't come to an agreement with the Russians, who are, as events have demonstrated, far more powerful, well, this is not something that can involve the United States. And that, it seems to me, is essentially the purpose of what the Americans are doing. Now, to repeat again, I have read most of these articles. In fact, I've read all of the articles that I've been talking about, the ones that I've seen. I haven't read many others. I'm sure that lots and lots of others. But nowhere, not in a single article that waxes so critical about the actions of the current US administration, is the fact that the Americans are not, in fact, negotiating with the Russians about the future of Ukraine or the contours of the settlement in Ukraine. Nowhere in any place is that conceded. The Americans, as I said, have spoken about getting the Russians and the Ukrainians together. The Ukrainians so far refuse, and this is a point which I'm going to return to again later in the program, but they are not and have not negotiated with the Russians any compromise or deal over Ukraine. And it's as simple as that. It is absolutely straightforward. The discussions which took place last week in Riyadh did not set out the details or the contours of a peace agreement in Ukraine. The two sides exchanged views about the conflict and its origins. The Americans said that they would appoint an envoy, a person who would speak with the Russians going forward about the Ukrainian conflict. The Russians said that once they know who this person is, they will appoint someone with an analogous position. Apparently there are expert groups going to be set up to discuss this problem more particularly, but there's going to be various other expert groups as well. but there was no discussions about ceasefires, armistices, buffer zones, demilitarized zones, Putin's June 2024 proposals, which, except that the Russians reiterated that those remain their proposals. There was no substantive negotiation of any kind whatsoever. So that is the first thing to say. The second is that nowhere in any of these articles that I have seen is there any admission of the fact that Ukraine is refusing to engage the Russians in negotiations. I've not seen a single reference in any of these articles to Zelensky's 2nd October 2022 decree, in which he prohibited Ukraine from negotiating with the Russians. I've not seen this anywhere. And of course, over the last 10 days or so, even as all the sound and fury has raged, Zelensky has not shifted from that position. He's talked in recent weeks about his willingness to negotiate with the Russians, but as I discussed in my program yesterday, he's come up with one condition after another condition of what he wants the United States to do. He wants the United States to give Ukraine weapons, unlimited financial support, unlimited military aid, missiles, guarantees, you name it, he wants it. And only then will he talk to the Russians. He is asking the Americans to go on giving him, in other words, a blank check. And if the Americans, of course, continue to do that, well, he will have no incentive or need to negotiate at all. And that is plainly his objective. So nowhere have I seen this fact pointed out. But there is an even more glaring omission, or rather there are two even more glaring omissions. Firstly, not a single one of these articles admits to the simple fact that the Russians are winning the war in Ukraine. Not only are winning the war in Ukraine, but if the war continues, that they will win the war in Ukraine, that Ukraine will be comprehensively defeated and will be forced to capitulate. This will happen whether American aid to Ukraine continues or not. If the United States continues to give aid at the same level that the Biden administration did, or conceivably increases the amount of aid that the Biden administration previously gave, well, that will slow the Russians down somewhat and increase the level of casualties and the level of devastation in Ukraine. But it is absolutely clear now that it will not change the outcome of the war. And if we're talking about the Europeans, it has become blindingly obvious over the last 10 days that they are not in a position to take the place of the United States. They cannot supply weapons or materials or financial aid to Ukraine in quantities that would replace those provided by the United States. And given that doing so would still bring us to the end point of a Russian victory, there is in fact no logical point in doing so. Now, here I'm going to say that the European media, are trapped in their own information bubble. Now, of course, Zelensky talked about Trump being trapped in an information bubble and insinuated that this is a Russian information bubble. But it seems to me that if we're talking about information bubbles, that far more accurately describes what has been going on in the West, especially in Europe, over the last 3 years. Now, I say Europe because, of course, in the United States, though most of the media has been strongly supportive of Ukraine in the United States, unlike in Europe, especially in the more heavyweight foreign policy magazines, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The National Interest, and even in the mainstream media there, in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and most especially in the very large and rather high quality media in the United States that is published and read by people in the military or people who are veterans in the military, there has been discussion of the realities of the war that are of a much higher quality and far more diverse and open-minded than anything I have seen published in Europe. Just saying. Well, if we go back to the European media, their basic narrative is that Ukraine, well, it might be retreating, but that the Russians, in order to make gains, are suffering astronomical losses. All kinds of fantastic figures quoted as to how great those losses are. They've supposedly achieved no major breakthroughs. The Institute for the Study of War, which is the outlet from which most of the media in Europe appear to get their information about the war, recently said that all that the Russians have captured are villages and small villages and empty fields, disregarding, as the American scholar and analyst Gordon Hahn has pointed out, that Avdiivka, Toretsk, Ocheretino, Kurakovo, Selidovo, Ugledar, all of these places, whatever they are, they cannot be described as small villages or empty fields. Anyway, they follow that line that the Russians have made only small, incremental advances, that they've not achieved any great breakthroughs, that Ukraine is somehow holding its own, that there is some kind of a stalemate, that the Ukrainians still manage to hit back at the Russians because of their courage, their resilience, their intelligence, their tactical skill, all those things. Anyway, this is the narrative that the European media has been feeding the European public over the last year, and it bears no relation to the truth. If you don't want to take it from me, then take it from Colonel Reisner of the Austrian Army, who has published a video, which you can find on YouTube, in which he makes exactly the point that I've made before. He talks about how the Russians have fought a war of attrition, how the Ukrainian military is now in a desperate condition because of the success of this war of attrition that the Russians have been fighting. And he even uses exactly the same metaphor as I have done, though I want to stress I'm not in any way suggesting that he's taken it from me. The metaphor of Russia as a powerful, heavyweight boxer up against a much lighter opponent. In the initial parts of the battle, the lighter opponent can sometimes land a few blows, but as time wears on, as the fight wears on, the strength and weight and power of the more heavyweight boxer inevitably tells. And, well, that's what Colonel Reisner is saying. And, of course, he is right. So there is no admission anywhere in the media that the war is lost, that you can go on sending more and more weapons to Ukraine, and you can go on providing Ukraine with more and more financial assistance. You can deplete your arsenals, your inventories, which has been happening right across Europe. Inventories across Europe are at desperate levels. You can go on shoveling money at Ukraine. There was that article that I discussed a few days ago, which appeared in the Daily Telegraph, which estimated, and I accept it was only an estimate, it was hedged round with caveats, but it estimated that the cost to Britain alone, of the war in the first 2 years, 2022-2023, was just short of £80 billion, pounds, £80 billion, £40 billion a year. And for the record, I don't think that cost has fallen to any significant degree. And my own guess is that the actual cost is higher still. But, I'm not going to argue the point. Maybe on that I'm wrong. But anyway, you will find no discussions about this at all. Instead, as I said, the pretense that Ukraine is holding its own when it plainly isn't, when anybody who follows the war closely can see that it isn't. On that topic, by the way, there's been a long article in the Washington Post talking again about the desperate shortage of manpower now in the Ukrainian brigades, how the Ukrainians are up against brigades, Russian brigades that are up to strength, how the Russians are far more fully supplied with every type of equipment than the Ukrainians are, how it is very, very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold their positions in the face of this lopsided preponderance of manpower and equipment that the Russians have. And, well, I will discuss the situation in the war a little bit further on, but that is self-evidently true. But then, of course, that article appears in the American media. No doubt many journalists in Europe have read it, but none of them, of course, have republished it. Just saying. So there is this glaring omission, this refusal to accept the fundamental reality that the war in Ukraine is already lost. You can go on supplying weapons and military equipment to Ukraine at whatever quantities you want. You cannot make up for the manpower losses. The idea of mobilizing 18 to 25-year-olds, which appears to be melting away in Ukraine, is not going to change the situation on the battlefronts in any fundamental way. It is merely going to prolong the fighting a little longer at the cost of many young lives, deepening Ukraine's already critical demographic problems. So there is no possible outcome in this war which can lead to victory. Now, I mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Reisner. You can follow Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, Colonel Douglas McGregor, all sorts of military people in the West, American military people especially, have been making these points for some time now. It seems to me that Colonel Reisner, he's a European officer, but he's just basically caught up again with what the American military people are saying. So that is one glaring omission. The other glaring omission is any proposal, any suggestion at all about what the Europeans in this situation should do. If they don't approve or like what the Americans are doing, what do they propose should be done in its place? We are, after all, talking about a war, and we do need to have some kind of strategy as to how to deal with a war, especially when it is a war that is being lost. Pointing fingers, shouting betrayal, talking in the most offensive terms about the President of the United States and his officials is all very well. It might impress rhetorically, just as all those incredibly offensive and abusive things that have been said about the Russian president and his officials also do. I mean, they might be rhetorically effective. But how does that change the situation? The actual situation on the battlefronts. How does it improve Ukraine's position? The short answer is it doesn't. If you think that the American strategy is wrong, then please propose an alternative. I've seen no one do so. I have seen no suggestions, no constructive suggestions as to what the European leaders think should be done in place of what has been done already and in place of what the Americans are now trying to do. Instead, it's more of the same. Send more weapons to Ukraine. Don't, of course, send troops to Ukraine. Even Keir Starmer accepts that British troops cannot be sent to Ukraine, at least not openly sent to Ukraine, whilst the fighting is ongoing. He knows perfectly well that the British public would never accept it. He also knows perfectly well that the Russians would defeat the British in record time, given the many problems that the British military has, which I have discussed in various programs. So we're not going to fight for Ukraine. We're going to send more weapons to Ukraine. We are, of course, already desperately short of weapons. Our ability to produce more weapons is limited and as has been also exposed vividly over the course of the war. There's been more comments and more statements about this from Poland, by the way. The Poles are now saying quite openly that they have only a few days of ammunition available if they were to find themselves in a conflict with Russia. Just saying. So pretend that you're going to supply Ukraine with more weapons that don't exist. Ask the Americans to deplete their arsenals even more. And American arsenals are much bigger than European arsenals, but they too are becoming increasingly depleted. Presumably go on escalating. One of the blessings that we have had since Trump was inaugurated is that the missile strikes into Russia, missile strikes which were total failures. And I think, again, this point needs to be made. This game-changing thing that was going to happen, the missile strikes with the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows and the Scalps deep into Russia, well, they did take place, not on any very particularly big scale. And the Russian Air Force and the Russian air defense system had no problem shooting down nearly all of the missiles, and only very, very limited damage in the end was done. So go on looking for further ways to escalate, come up with all sorts of exaggerated and fantastic ideas. Not that anybody, by the way, on that front is currently coming up with any particular fantastic ideas. But anyway, go on supplying Ukraine weapons, deplete your arsenals even more, leave yourself even more exposed for a Russian attack when the war ends, because all the weapons you have already been sent to Ukraine and have been lost there. Put yourself in that position and just go on doing it and expect at some point some different result to the result that we've seen over the last 3 years. And of course, sanctions. More sanctions. The European Union has just, it hasn't yet approved its latest sanctions package, but the EU Ambassadors Council has done so. Orban is again threatening to veto this latest sanctions package when it goes to the proper European Council. I think this time there's just a small chance that he might do so. He would know that he has Donald Trump's backing in doing it, and probably Fico in Slovakia would support him, and he might have some quiet support from some of the other EU states as well. But I'm not going to hold my breath and wait and see whether that happens. Of course, if the elections which are taking place in Germany today, whose results you will probably know by the time you are watching this program, if those election results result in a major breakthrough for the AfD, that might encourage Orban to wield his veto power. But since it's an almost foregone conclusion that Friedrich Merz will be the next Chancellor of Germany, given the electoral arithmetic and the balance of forces in the likely balance of forces in the German parliament. Even if that were to happen, even if the AfD were to significantly exceed the polling figures assigned to it in the various opinion polls, I'm still not convinced that that would be enough to get Orban to actually wield his veto. But then again, who's to say? We'll just have to wait and see. But anyway, the EU has unveiled its sanctions package, completely ineffective, as that is certain to be. The British government tomorrow is apparently preparing to unveil a further sanctions package as well. We're told it will be the most severe sanctions package that Britain has unveiled to date, other than the ones that it unveiled in February 2022 and in the weeks after. I can't imagine that the Russians are going to take sanctions imposed on them by Britain at all seriously. And of course the Americans, by contrast, much more practically, are talking about moving towards an eventual lifting of sanctions, and they have apparently rejected proposals to lower the price cap on Russian oil, a price cap that the market has ignored, the oil market has ignored anyway. So, more of the same, more articles appearing every day about the economy in Russia overheating, about a financial crisis, about how Russia is facing all kinds of long-term problems, even as the Russian economy continues to grow. By the way, Putin and various other Russian officials have been making various statements about what would happen if sanctions were lifted. They've made it absolutely clear that there will be no going back to the world which existed before the sanctions were imposed. They've said very clearly that supports and protections for Russian domestic industry would remain in place. Apparently, there would be no big purchases of Boeing and Airbus aircraft again. The Russians will focus on their own aerospace projects. They will no longer buy their turbines from Siemens. They have a new production of turbines designed by the factory that produces fighter jet engines. Just saying, salute. The Russians have made it absolutely clear that they are not going to reverse the industrial strategies that they have followed over the last 3 years and which have worked so well. And Renault, the French car company, which had been involved in manufacturing Russian Lada cars, has recently indicated that it would like to return to Russia if sanctions were lifted. But Russian officials are saying that it's far from a foregone conclusion that it would be welcomed back. So there's not going to be any massive shift in Russian industrial policy. Quite the contrary. And I'm going to say that illusions, fantasies that the inflation spike we have seen in Russia over the last year is going to create severe long-term problems for the Russian economy. I think by the end of this year, all of that will be exposed as the illusion that it actually is. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss any of this now. But anyway, more of the same. That is all that European leaders can offer. They have nothing else to offer at all. And Macron and Starmer are going to head to Washington next week. I had assumed that they were going together, that it would be a joint visit, but I'm not so sure anymore. I understand that Macron is hoping to go to Washington first and to meet with Trump first, and he's going to bring his team with him. And Starmer will be going apparently on Thursday and meeting Trump and his team on that day also. Well, they're going. They cannot provide anything that the Americans will find impressive. They're going to, again, apparently, talk about peacekeeping forces sent to Ukraine. Only they're no longer called peacekeeping forces. They're being called reassurance forces. A significant change of title. One which, again, essentially tells us that they're not there to enforce any ceasefire, but rather they are intended to act as a kind of forward force in a forthcoming battle with the Russians, in which the Americans are expected to become involved. Anyway, the French are going to go and they're going to set out their plans, and Starmer is going to go and he's going to set out his plans, and the total amount that they can offer the Americans in terms of war fighting against the Russians, because that's what we're talking about, is 30,000 men, and they expect that the Americans will provide air cover for this force. I cannot imagine that the Americans are going to be impressed by any of this in any conceivable way. But anyway, that's where we are. We are looking at anger, panic, hysteria, despair, the final understanding that Project Ukraine is about to collapse, all of that. We're reading, every article that I'm reading, it talks about the collapse of the Western alliance, about how NATO is about to disintegrate, about all of those things, about how that is Putin's intention, that his intention supposedly is to break up the NATO alliance and to get the Americans to leave Europe so that he can carry out his wicked plans to conquer Europe, or at least to dominate it. Anyway, I'm reading all about this, but of positive, realistic, creative proposals, I see no evidence at all. No one, not a single political figure, not a single commentator or journalist, not a single think tank has come up with any kind of proposal at all about how this process can be taken forward. By contrast, those who have been advocating some kind of engagement between the Americans and the Russians for a long time, those who have been calling for a resumption of dialogue between America and Russia, the Quincy Institute, for example, they are coming up with proposals, proposed ideas. The Quincy Institute, for example, has come up with a long list of things that the Americans might do and not do, that they should hold out for sanctions relief, that they should not immediately press for a ceasefire, which the Russians have rejected. Well, I'm not going to go over it because doing so would take up a lot of time, and all I will say is you can find it all on the Responsible Statecraft website. It's, I think, realistic, and a lot of it is filled with common sense. I am not sure that the Russians would agree to every suggestion that is made there. But anyway, those people, people like the Quincy Institute, who have suggested engagement, they are making constructive proposals. But the European leaders, the EU, all of them, they are making none. Now, here, I have to just repeat a point that I have made before. Behind all of the anger, the talk of betrayal, and Der Spiegel, by the way, the German magazine, which I can remember once upon a time what a very fine magazine it was. That was long ago in another universe far away, just saying. But I still remember the old Der Spiegel, just as I still remember the old Guardian and the old Financial Times and the old New York Times and all of those. Anyway, today's Der Spiegel has a cover with Zelensky's face on it, and of course it just has the one word betrayal. But so, you get all of that kind of talk, all the talk of betrayal, of treachery, of duplicity, all the attempts to read Donald Trump's mind instead of doing what is not difficult to do at all, which is to read what he says, in which he makes his intentions and his purposes completely clear. Well, all of this anger, hysteria, panic, fear, it is all ultimately about fear. It is about the nightmare that the Americans might eventually quit Europe completely, that the Europeans will be left all alone. Now, here I think a few points do need to be said. Firstly, I think it is more likely than not that at some point over the next 10 years, the Americans will start to make a decision to leave Europe. But that's not what they're saying at the moment. They're saying that eventually they might go, but they're not saying that they're going to go now. Nor are they saying that they're going to end NATO today, nor have they reached any agreements with the Russians over the heads of the Europeans and the Ukrainians, nor are the Ukrainians and the Europeans being meaningfully excluded from any talks about Ukraine, which the Americans and the Russians do not intend to engage in with each other anyway, just saying. A lot of these fears have no factual basis behind them. They express fears about what might happen in the future, not about what is actually happening now. All that is happening now is that the Russians and the Americans, after a 3-year break, a very dangerous 3-year break, are once again speaking to each other. That is all. Now, going forward, where are we at this point? Well, the reports say that the Americans and the Russians are going to have another meeting, probably, I guess, in Riyadh on Tuesday. We'll see what that amounts to. I suspect that the purpose of that meeting will be a summit meeting between Trump and Putin. Trump has scotched the story that he intends to go to Moscow to attend the Victory Day celebrations there. I said previously that I thought that was most unlikely to happen. I didn't believe that Donald Trump, who is a skillful politician, if nothing else, would do something like that, which he would know would be controversial in the United States. And sure enough, he's confirmed that he has no intention of doing it. Again, a lot of wild talk, a lot of disinformation as well, by the way. Yesterday, I discussed in my program American threats supposedly made to the Ukrainians that if they didn't sign the minerals deal, the Americans would cut off the Starlink terminals in Ukraine, basically ending Ukraine's ability to operate its drones or to provide reliable and secure communication for its troops. All of this, by the way, appeared in the British news agency Reuters. This was widely publicized right across the internet. It was discussed in Ukraine extensively. The Russian media picked it up as well, by the way, though they were a little bit more skeptical than some of the others. It was all over the European media. And then, of course, Elon Musk, went out on X and flatly denied it. He said that Reuters, yet again, has purveyed fake news. Notice that this is Reuters, once the most prestigious news agency in the world. It has ceased to be so, as far as I'm concerned, for some time. It's publishing story after story, especially since the Ukraine conflict began, based on all sorts of sources, the nature of which are never really disclosed or verifiable. And, well, it seems that this story about the cut-off of Starlink was simply not true. But even as the Russians and the Americans are meeting, even as the Russians again reiterate, as they continuously do, that they are absolutely prepared to talk, all the Ukrainians have to do is to rescind the 2nd October 2022 decree and appoint a negotiating team. Even as all of that goes on, we also got further news yesterday that Zelensky, despite increasingly strong demands from the Americans, continues to refuse to sign the mineral deal. I've said that the Americans are getting increasingly exasperated and fed up with Zelensky, that they're increasingly asking themselves whether or not this is somebody who can be trusted, whether he is reliable. Marco Rubio, in an interview, has now all but called Zelensky a liar over this question, saying that he says that he will sign the deal one day, refuses to sign it the next, does all of those kind of things. Well, for the moment, Zelensky continues to refuse to sign the deal. And, well, one wonders what will happen if he sticks to that position, which, for the moment, he seems inclined to. My own guess about this particular story, by the way, is that Zelensky has done all kinds of deals about mineral rights and did so some time ago with all kinds of businessmen and oligarchs and people like that. And he needs their support to stay in power. And they've made it very, very clear to him over the last couple of days that if he does sign this deal and hands over the rights, he takes the rights away from these people and hands them over to the Americans, that he will lose their support, which of course could be fatal for him in the inevitable power struggles in Ukraine, which sooner or later are going to start. So, for the moment at least, Zelensky is holding out. The Americans continue to pile up the pressure, but if Zelensky refuses to sign, what will the Americans do? Well, in spite of Elon Musk's denials, I think that at some point the Americans will start to cut off aid, and I suspect at some point also, though clearly no such decision has been made so far, the Americans will also cut off the Starlink system as well. So I think that is probably where we're heading. If Zelensky signs the mineral deal, sooner or later we're going to get back to the position where the Americans become more angry and frustrated with him. Clearly, there is a divorce underway between America and Ukraine. This is completely unsurprising. And by the way, it has happened before. As I've said previously, other American proxies, President Thieu of South Vietnam, President Ghani of Afghanistan, also proved unwilling to do America's bidding in order to bring peace to their respective countries. And in both cases, the result is that they were driven from power and their countries fell under the sway of their military and political opponents. And anyway, we will see what Zelensky does and what comes of this and of the politics in Kiev. But again, the baffling story, the really strange story, is why the European leaders continue to cling on to Zelensky. Why the French, the British, continue to insist that Zelensky is some sort of Churchillian character. I've read so many articles, especially in the British media, which make that comparison between him and Churchill. I wonder what Churchill would have thought of it. Anyway, I can't imagine anybody more different from Zelensky than Churchill, just saying. But anyway, I read article after article which continues to talk up Zelensky, speak up for Zelensky, look the other way from Zelensky's various deeds. His closing of newspapers, his arrest of opponents, his banning of political parties, his suppression of the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church. I've seen extraordinary attempts, by the way, to justify some of these moves. Just saying. Anyway, why European leaders have nailed themselves to this mast, which is Vladimir Zelensky, even as the Ukrainian ship is holed beneath the waterline and continues to sink. What exactly it is that they think they're doing, I really just am completely unable to understand. I, by the way, over the last couple of weeks, received some information about Zelensky and the kind of things he gets up to. It came from, well, it was at many removes. I was at many removes from the original source. I believe this information is correct, but I'm not going to disclose what it is. First of all, because I'm not in direct contact with the original source. And secondly, because I don't want to do anything that might cause anybody any embarrassment or difficulty. All I will say is that I do believe this information. And it is of such a nature that it makes it absolutely clear to me that all of the things that have been said about Zelensky, all of the comments that have been made, all the criticisms that are made about Zelensky are not only true, but if anything, understate his, well, what shall I call it, eccentricity, if you like. The idea that European leaders, the leaders of Britain and France and Germany, should attach themselves to the cause of this man who is bringing about the destruction of his country and who will pull them down with him is beyond my understanding. It's not a case of the Zelensky curse reaching these people. It is of them embracing him. Just saying. But anyway, there we go. What is going to happen? What Zelensky is going to do? Maybe, well, he will sign the mineral deal. Maybe he will come to some kind of understanding with the United States over it. But as I said, eventually there will be a parting of the ways. American support will end. I don't believe there's going to be negotiations because I don't think Zelensky is capable of conducting negotiations. I don't think anyone else in Kiev at the moment is capable of conducting negotiations either. And I think that the war will progress and move forward towards an inevitable outcome, which will be more like the fall of Saigon than anything else. But let me say a few further things here. And I want to address some of the points that the Europeans are making. Firstly, they say that Trump telephoning Putin, American officials meeting with Russian officials, has ended Putin's and Russia's isolation. Again, what planet are these people living under? Are they unaware of the BRICS? Are they unaware of the fact that the president of China and the president of Brazil have accepted invitations to visit Moscow on the occasion of the Victory Day celebrations on the 9th of May? Did the Kazan BRICS summit pass them by unnoticed? Are they unaware that President Putin gets on very well with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, that the President of Egypt calls President Putin his friend, and that his other friend, President Putin's other friend, Prime Minister Modi, is inviting President Putin to visit India this year? In what possible way is Putin isolated? Just saying. And the other story that has been spun, the other argument that has been spun, is that, well, if the Americans think that by sacrificing Ukraine to the Russians, they're going to help themselves with the Chinese, they're sadly mistaken, because a weakened and broken Europe would in that case be in no position to help the United States in the Asia-Pacific region anyway. This is completely wrong, because the European powers have no ability to help the United States in the Asia-Pacific region anyway. The Europeans can only cobble together 30,000 men to send to Ukraine as a peacekeeping or reassurance force. They still want American air cover if they deploy there. If they can only send 30,000 troops to Ukraine, which is geographically in Europe, how many men realistically can they send to support the Americans in the Asia Pacific? I mean, it's absurd. And the other claim that if the Russians triumph in Ukraine, that will endanger Europe and will oblige the Americans to keep their forces in Europe. Well, that actually is true. But that is precisely the scenario that negotiations with the Russians is intended to avoid. An attempt to try to find some kind of understanding with the Russians. Because a Russian victory in Ukraine is going to create precisely that scenario which the Europeans are frightening the Americans with. It's going to create precisely that kind of scenario far more certainly. The way to avoid it is to come to some kind of understanding with the Russians, which will stabilize the situation in Europe. Now, going back to that piece by the Quincy Institute, yesterday, you can find it all in Responsible Statecraft. They understand that completely. They say that if the United States talks only about Ukraine with the Russians, that would not only put the Russians in a position of decisive advantage, given that they are in a position of decisive advantage in the war anyway, but it would not serve the interests of the United States, which are better served by trying to find some way to reach some kind of general understanding with the Russians about the wider security situation in Europe. There is, interestingly enough, even an article in The Hill which admits this. This is this American magazine, which is widely read by people in Congress, apparently. It says that the long-term interests of the United States are to look for some kind of means to integrate Russia into the security structures, the general security structures in Europe. Now, this article in The Hill, in my opinion, doesn't address many of the Russian concerns, but it gets the main point, that an understanding with Russia, given that the Russians are about to win the war in Ukraine, an understanding with Russia is the only way to do that. And then there's a third point that I've read, which is that by talking to the Russians, by acknowledging that Russia is a great power, as opposed to what Barack Obama said back in 2014, that Russia is only a regional power, that has somehow conceded something to Putin. What has it conceded? Russia is a great power. It's not a matter of conceding it. It is a matter of fact. It's high time people in Europe started to address those facts, again, rather than striking rhetorical poses and doing all those kind of things. Well, I've devoted a lot of time to this, and I'm not going to say more. There's going to be, as I said, another meeting between the Russians and the Americans, apparently on Tuesday, possibly in Riyadh. Suffice to say that there's been no rethinking of anything in Europe over the last 10 days or so. The Europeans continue to be in shock and anger and all of those things, but they show no ability for strategic thinking or attempt to understand what the present situation calls for, the kind of statesmanship that the present situation calls for. There's been two fine articles about this. One is in the National Interest by Matthew Blackburn, Europe's Reality Check, which sets out the fact that the Europeans do need to do some hard reading, hard thinking about their situation. And perhaps another article, very interesting article by Conor Gallagher in Naked Capitalism, how much more is Europe prepared to lose? Which I think is absolutely correct, because when you lose a war, the only way to limit the damage is through negotiations. At least come to some kind of agreement that cuts your losses. Of course, if you're not prepared to do that, then inevitably your losses are going to be greater still. Anyway, I'm going to make a guess, it's not a prediction, but that for the Americans, the forthcoming meeting with the Russians on Tuesday is going to be far more important than the meetings with Macron and Starmer. They will probably listen to what Macron and Starmer have to say, but the British and the French are coming basically empty-handed. They continue to strike poses of entitlement and continue to make demands. The Americans will feel that the Europeans, like the Ukrainians, are still demanding basically that they be provided basically with open checks. And there's been a long article, there's been this interview by Marco Rubio discussing Ukraine, discussing Zelensky himself, which makes essentially the same point, that Zelensky, whenever the United States, even during the Biden administration, came forward and gave Ukraine military and economic aid, all he would do is he would pocket the aid and, with an air of extraordinary entitlement, go on demanding more and more still and still more, and to the point where even Joe Biden eventually got frustrated. What the Americans are saying, both to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans is that the period of America's open-ended checkbook is now over in Ukraine, over European security, and over all other things. The Europeans can either sort out their security by increasing defense spending, which is impossible actually for them to do, or they can do the more sensible thing, which is to come to terms with the Russians. But the Americans are not prepared to go on writing blank checks as they've been doing, certainly for Zelensky, up to now. Anyway, that's where we are. Fury, rage, as people suddenly understand in Ukraine and Europe that the era of the blank checks has ended. We will see where this goes. Now, here I'm going to turn again to the military situation, because over the last 24 hours, there's been more news from the battle lines. Firstly, the Russians have conducted the biggest ever single drone assault on Ukraine that they have done over the course of this conflict. According to the Ukrainians, 238 geranium drones assaulted Ukraine last night. Now, for the Russians, this is an extremely cheap thing to do. Every missile costs tens upon tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of rubles. A geranium-2 drone made of far lighter materials, much simpler piece of technology and kit, costs only a fraction of that amount. So this is a very cost-effective way for the Russians to conduct attacks across Ukraine. And they're able to do it because, of course, they're now producing these drones on an enormous industrial scale from their factory in Kazan. The Ukrainians have attempted to launch attacks on the Kazan factory, but those attacks have been ineffective. And according to the Ukrainians, out of the 238 geranium-2 drones that the Russians launched against Ukraine last night, the Ukrainians were able to shoot down just over half. The others presumably got through, though the Ukrainians are very, very cagey about admitting to this fact. So there's been significant destruction across Ukraine as these geranium-2 drones strike their various targets. Odessa was particularly hit, but there's also been attacks in various other places as well. The singular point about this is, again, the weakness of Ukraine's air defense system. And again, the contrast between the relative ineffectiveness of Ukraine's air defense system and the far more effective air defense system that the Russians have. Now, the Ukrainians have also on occasion launched attacks on Russia with hundreds of drones, never an attack on quite this vast scale. But when the Ukrainians do launch attacks on Russia with large numbers of drones, the vast majority of the drones are verifiably shot down by the Russian air defense system, which, given the size of Russia and the impossibility of protecting every target, even every military target, at the same level, is actually very impressive. Ukraine, over a smaller territory, was only able to shoot down around half the drones that the Russians launched. This again demonstrates how fragile, how weak the position of Ukraine's air defense system has now become, how powerful Russian drone attacks have become. The Ukrainians are complaining about shortages of Patriot interceptors. Well, one would not want to use Patriot interceptors against geranium-2 drones, but it looks as if even the lighter air defense systems that Ukraine had have been depleted. Probably the various cannons and those sort of things that exist across Ukraine, most of them are still there. But it seems that the Russians have been targeting the radar systems, and it looks as if they've achieved a significant amount of success. Anyway, I'm not going to spend more time about this. The facts of the drone strike and the Ukrainian admission that around half the drones got through speaks for itself. Now, elsewhere, the Russians have now confirmed that Urakli in the Andreevka fortified area has fallen. The Andreevka itself has fallen. That whole fortified area appears to be rapidly moving towards collapse. The Russians continue to advance westwards from the area west of Selidovo and the area west of Velikaya Novosilka. Various villages and communities have been captured by the Russians. In fact, every day now, I think, some new communities or villages or settlements are captured by the Russians. The Russians make announcements like that now so often, pretty much every day, that it hardly attracts a great deal of attention. And there are further reports that the Russians have significantly now escalated their operations in the Siversk area, where the Russians have played, I think, a game of cat and mouse with the Ukrainians. The Russians have launched attacks towards Siversk, then there have been pullbacks, there have been counter battles, there's been all sorts of things. I don't want to deny the Ukrainians' own skill and ability to defend Siversk over the last 3 years. What I would say is probably there is a very aggressive and capable, unusually capable, Ukrainian officer in charge of the Ukrainian forces in this area. But I also get the impression that the Russians have, until recently, never committed big forces to try to capture Siversk. What they've been mostly doing in the Siversk area is keeping the Ukrainians busy to prevent the Ukrainians redeploying forces from Siversk to other theatres. And anyway, this looks to have changed. General Gerasimov, who is the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces and the overall commander of Russian forces fighting in the area of the special military operation. Anyway, he has visited the general area of Siversk. He's spoken, he's met with the local Russian commander, Colonel General Sanchik, who was appointed to this post some months ago. He appears to be a rather more senior commander than the commanders who were previously in charge in this area. And overall, I get the sense that the Russians now have made a decision that the time has come, now that the area, the towns on the Zherebets River have been captured, Yampolovka having been captured most recently, that the time has come to finish the Battle of Siversk. And there's been reports that the Russians have now captured important positions around Siversk, the big mound near the village of Belogorovka, the slag heap close to Belogorovka, the village of Belogorovka, that they've captured and conclusively captured the hill north of Verkhokamyanska. They appear to be in control of the eastern part of that village. And anyway, my sense is that over the next couple of weeks, probably in March, we will finally see a serious attempt by the Russians to capture Siversk, which will anchor the Russian offensive west of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers when it is finally launched. I've always felt that one of the major reasons why the Russian positions in Kharkiv region in particular, the territories that the Russians had captured in Kharkiv region, proved in the end undefendable when the Ukrainians launched their counteroffensive in the autumn of 2022, was because the Russians had not captured Siversk and had failed as a result to establish a continuous front line. Anyway, I think this time it's going to be different. The Russians already control or are close to controlling most of the transport corridors to Siversk, and I think that in the next couple of weeks or months, with the advance to the Zherebets River, the Russians will make a serious attempt to capture Siversk. And going elsewhere, there are reports that for the first time, a Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group briefly entered the northern suburbs of Kupiansk. These are the northern suburbs of Kupiansk, located west of the Oskol River. About 2 months ago, the Russians briefly carried out a raid which occupied some of Kupiansk, some of the areas of Kupiansk that lie east of the Oskol River. That created quite an alarm for the Ukrainians. They had to redeploy forces from the west bank of the Oskol River to push the Russians out. That made it possible for the Russians, for their part, to cross the Oskol River and to establish their bridgehead. And now, with that bridgehead having been significantly enlarged, the Russians have launched their first probing attack from the north towards Kupiansk. Now, to make it clear, this was, in my opinion, a raid or a reconnaissance operation. It was not intended to hold any part of Kupiansk for any length of time, but it also reinforces the impression that over the next couple of weeks there will be an offensive by the Russians to capture Kupiansk, probably in the spring. So in the spring we will see Russian offensives to capture Siversk and Kupiansk, and probably in the west Pokrovsk as well. And of course the offensives around Kupiansk, Liman, which lies to the west of the Zherebets River, Siversk, will all be coordinated with the Russian advance towards Konstantinovka, the southern part of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation. That advance, which will take place from the two cities, the two big towns that are in the process of being captured, Toretsk, which has of course already been captured, but also Chasiv Yar, which most analysts expect the Russians will have obtained full control over by the first half of March. Just saying. Now, these are dramatic events, though I suspect the most dramatic events of all that are going to play out over the next couple of weeks will continue to be in the Kursk area. The Russians have captured the village of Sverlikovo, which I discussed recently. Apparently, they have now entered the village of Lebyedevo, which lies to the north west of this village. This is putting them in a closer position to cut off the main road from Sumy to Suja, which lies just to the south. And, well, the Ukrainians are apparently launching counterattacks to prevent the Russians reaching the main road this same road from Sumy to Suja, in the area where the Russians have crossed the border in Kharkiv region, and they appear apparently, or at least there are claims that they have pushed the Russians back. But of course, these ephemeral Ukrainian counterattacks, as we have seen many times, ultimately achieve nothing. So, this is the state of the war. There is one point I want to make, and it's one that I have made many times. I used to make it very often in the early weeks of the war, which is that this war is going to be won in Donbass. If the Russian army is able to defeat the Ukrainians in Donbass, if they break Ukrainian resistance there, if they break through all of the fortified positions that the Ukrainians created in Donbass, then firstly, it will be all but impossible for the Ukrainians to hold back the Russians from occupying all of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River. It would become possible for the Russians to advance to the Dnieper, not just in the area of Zaporozhye, where they're currently advancing, but further north as well. And the Russians would be very well positioned if they control all of these places: Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Izium, Balakleya, all of these places. They would be very well positioned in that case to launch offensives to capture even big cities like Kharkiv and Poltava and Sumy, bringing them very, very close, by the way, again, to Kiev. And this is perhaps something that is not especially well understood, but if you follow the pattern of the fighting in the Second World War, you can see that control of Donbass essentially is the key. Now, the question is, if the Russians do capture Donbass, will they stop? They are already very close to the border with Dnipro region, but we're talking about Dnipro region east of the Dnieper. The key question is, will the Russians stop at the Dnieper once Donbass has fallen completely under their control? If the Russians cross the Dnieper, and apparently there have been more pictures and film of Russian troops exercising a crossing over a big river, which in Ukrainian terms can only be the Dnieper. If the Russians cross the Dnieper, then it's not just game over in terms of the war, it is game over in terms of Ukraine. There are cities which could be fortified: Kryvyi Rog, Nikopol, Kremenchuk, but there is a huge amount of empty space in central Ukraine, west of the Dnieper, which would be very difficult to defend. And of course, if the Ukrainian army, already badly depleted, as that piece in the Washington Post says, and as Colonel Reisner has pointed out on his YouTube video, if the Ukrainian army has already been defeated east of the Dnieper, with what are the Ukrainians going to resist the Russians? So some people continue to look at Ukraine, they look at the size of the country, and they say to themselves, well, if it's taken the Russians this long to take control of the whole of Donbass, heavily fortified place that it is, with poor soil conditions for tanks apparently, a dense network of small towns, coal mines, factories, small rivers, that kind of thing. If it's taken the Russians this long. Well, how much longer is it going to take them to capture the whole of Ukraine? A point I started to make in the early weeks of this war, back in 2022. In my opinion, it would not take them that long at all. Obviously, we would not be looking at the total collapse of Ukraine in the space of weeks, but the problems of defending what is left of Ukraine will multiply as soon as the Russians have full control of Donbass, and will continue to multiply further if the Russians advance westwards beyond Donbass, and will compound and multiply still more if the Russians cross the Dnieper. The Russian Defense Ministry recently spoke about a cascading collapse, and it's not difficult to see how it could play out. So, contrary to what many people think, there isn't a huge amount of time. I think the Americans understand that. I'm not sure that other people in Europe do. But to repeat again a point I've made already, there isn't that much time. Kirill Budanov said that Ukraine can go on fighting until midsummer. Probably Russian strength will reach its peak point around midsummer. If Donbass has been basically conquered by the Russians midsummer, bar a peace agreement of some kind, we could be looking at the end of Ukraine. Now that is the concern that should currently worry European capitals. Not that the Americans and the Russians are talking to each other. That is a good thing. It is that Ukraine might not be so far away from reaching its crisis point, and that the Europeans have nothing to do militarily or in terms of economic pressure that can prevent that happening. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. I suspect there's going to be lots of things happening next week. More purges, if I can call them that, in Washington as the Trump-Musk duo tighten their grip there. No doubt we will see more angst and fury in Europe as the Americans and the Russians talk to each other. And in the meantime, in Ukraine, it's important to hold on to the point I've just made, because for Ukraine, to be very clear, time is running out. And this European propping up of a leader, Zelensky, who refuses to face that reality, could prove disastrous for the country and ultimately for Europe as well. Anyway, that's the end of my program today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me repeat again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget to check out your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button if you like this video. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.